Asante sana.
Karibuni to you both, and apologies for the slight mix-up there. We were missing one of our speakers, but we've got both of them here, and we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone, to what I'm sure will be a fascinating panel today with Stefan Ouma and Wangui Kimari. My name is Yusuf Al-Balushi, and I teach in the Department of Global and International Studies here at the University of California, Irvine. Today's event is part of a year-long Sawyer seminar at UC Irvine, supported by the Mellon Foundation. This year's theme is Black Reconstruction as a Portal. And the idea of the seminar is really to take up W.E.B. Du Bois's crucial study, Black Reconstruction in America, and his broader work as a conduit to our present global crisis. You can find more information about future events, as well as recordings of past events, on our website, blackreconstructionasaportal.org, or on Twitter @ReadingDuBois. I need to thank my comrade and co-director of the seminar, Damien Sojourner from UCI's Department of Anthropology. And we also want to thank Melissa Valdez, Monica Rodriguez, Marilyn Grell-Brisk, Temi Tope Famodu, Mariel Rowland, Amanda Swain, and Ekwa Arhin, who have all been instrumental in making this event possible. Today's panel is entitled Black Reconstruction Geographies in Africa. And our first speaker is Stefan Ouma, who since March 2019 has been holding the chair of economic geography at the Department of Geography at the University of Bayreuth in Germany. Before that, he worked as doc and postdoc at Goethe University, Frankfurt. His research interests lie in a theoretically and empirically informed economic geography of globalization and development, drawing primarily on insights from heterodox economics, political ecology, and post- and decolonial work. His overriding research goal is to rematerialize the economy in times of seemingly unbounded economic relations, and to open it up for political debate regarding the more sustainable and just pathways and forms of economy making. Dr. Ouma's current research is on the political economy and ecology of global supply chains, the financialization of land and agriculture, the digital transformation of labor, and on African futures, all reflect this orientation. He has research experience in both the global South, West, and East Africa, and the global North, Germany, New Zealand, and cultivates a global relational perspective on geographically uneven development processes. He's currently the PI in a DFG-funded project on venture capital and inequality in the Kenyan startup sector. And since the end of 2019, he's been a key member of the editorial collective Antipode, where he's really been inserting even more of a presence with regards to Africa into radical geography. And he's also part of the advisory board of Critical African Studies, Global Africa, Environment and Planning A, and the newly founded journal Finance and Space. Our second speaker, Wangui Kimari, is an anthropologist affiliated to the African Center for Cities, the ACC, at the University of Cape Town. Her work draws on many local histories and theoretical approaches, including oral narratives, the Black radical tradition, assemblage theory, urban political ecology, and diverse approaches to anthropology, in order to think through urban spatial management in Nairobi from the vantage point of its most marginalized residents. Dr. Kimari is also the Participatory Action Research Coordinator for the Mathare Social Justice Center, which is a community-based organization in Mathare, Nairobi, and a contributing editor to the online publication Africa is a Country, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with. She's also a co-founder of the Nairobi-based Critical Urban Studies Forum, UTADU, African Cities Workshop, which is an incredible gathering that she's been putting together in Nairobi. Please look it up if you haven't yet. It's really fascinating as a model for how to do intellectual inquiry in collaboration with a whole series of other thinkers. And also an Urban Studies Foundation trustee. and she sits on the editorial boards of Urban Geography, Africa, and Nokoko. Following the talks today, we'll open the conversation for a Q&A. So please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window by clicking at that tab. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Ouma.
Yes, thank you, Yusuf, and everybody for making this possible. Warm welcome also to Wangui and several other peoples I've known before. It's lovely to be with you here. Let me just share my screen. Yusuf, I hope you see the full screen, right?
Yes, we can see the full screen. Yeah.
Okay,
we see your presenter mode, if that's okay.
No, you should see, just a second. No, good. You see the full screen, right?
We still see presenter mode.
Still see presenter mode?
Yeah.
Strange. Still?
Yes, still.
Okay, then let me maybe reshare. If not, I have to give it in the presenter mode. But
okay, no worries. That's totally fine for us as well. Whatever works.
Okay. Still presenter mode?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, we can see the introduction slide and then to the side a Du Boisian start.
Yeah, then I have to do it this style, but I have a trick here. So now
yes.
you should not see a lot. Yeah, let me go right into the topic, Africapitalism via the Black Reconstruction, via 700 pages plus 700 pages book, which is obviously not an easy task. And I want to make a Du Boisian start here by letting you just read this quote from James Box. James Box was an activist, organic intellectual, a worker in Detroit, writing mainly in the 60s and 70s. And this is from his piece, The Myth and Irrationality of Black Capitalism. Now let me jump to Du Bois and Africapitalism, and we return to this quote later in the talk. Well, Africapitalism was coined by Nigerian business mogul Tony Elumelu. It has quickly captured the imagination of other academics, politicians, entrepreneurs, media people, the larger public. And in 2017, Elumelu pointed out that the, I quote, traditional approach to development where donors and governments invest in basic health, education, and access to food in developing countries with the hope that the beneficiaries will eventually become self-sufficient, that this one has failed. But he also says that past experiments in state-led development across Africa have failed, as much a more extractive form of neo-colonial capitalism has obviously failed. So he really tries to position Africapitalism beyond these past approaches, but also against other competing models, the China model, the South Korea model, the India model, large family run businesses, for instance. And I would call this Black Capitalism 2.0. And with the K capitalism, I mean intellectual or ideological musings about capitalism. And obviously, there was a 1.0 version of this, and you can travel back in time and arrive at people like Booker T. Washington and others in the North American context who quite early have thought about what could capitalism do for Black communities in terms of uplifting. And it's a debate that has actually never left us in the North American context. The goal of this intervention is not to criticize the idea of Africapitalism. This has been done elsewhere. I prepared a few snapshots here. Rather, I want to offer some further contextualization and address a number of questions that so far have received little attention in the existing engagements with the idea of Africapitalism. And I will do this via the work of Du Bois, and obviously I've just begun reading this work because my past interventions were not framed via Du Bois's work, but I found it a really stimulating opportunity when I got the invitation, and I hope something more will emerge out of this. So in a way, I see it as an opportunity for what Ryland Rabaka calls critical Africana theorizing. Maybe a brief note on what Du Bois's Black Reconstruction has to offer in terms of engaging with the idea of Africapitalism. So Du Bois's work, this book, other writings have a revolution from below focus, centering Black workers as agents of history, and more generally, I would say, workers as agents of history. So this is really important to engage with a narrative that is very capital-driven, Africapitalism. It has displayed a pioneering understanding, a twin understanding of capitalism and racism. It also offers a global relational understanding of development and underdevelopment, on which giants such as Williams, Rodney, Mintz, Sylvia Winter, and others built. And it invites for a kind of transatlantic analytical gaze, not just because of Du Bois's writing, but also because of his own biography. He had a very long life and eventually died as a Ghanaian citizen in Ghana in '63. And the topic of today, it offers a very interesting take on Reconstruction. For him, in the context of the US South, it meant what I would call emerging from the ashes of a wicked system. It meant, and I quote him here from the Black Reconstruction, efforts to earn a living in new and untried ways, to achieve economic security, to restore fatal losses of capital and investment. So this is Reconstruction for Du Bois in the Black Reconstruction, and obviously he tried to pose this as a counter-narrative to white supremacist accounts of the brief period after the Civil War. It also explores the possibilities and limits of interracial labor solidarity in a capitalist white supremacist system. And I think this is really important, and I got this from Black historian Gerald Horn in a recent piece. Eventually, Black Reconstruction is also world reconstruction. So it is not just enough to reconstruct, let's say, a kind of limited geographical domain where certain people live, but really, if we want to uplift Black communities, something much larger needs to happen, and this will be to the benefit of other people as well. So I think this is really important, and I think much of this can be transferred to Africa, which is partly a different context, but to address one crucial question that Du Bois also addressed in his book. What does it take to finish revolutions? The not yet Uhuru problem, to quote Oginga Odinga from his autobiography. So you have a cultural dimension there, you have a political dimension, but you also have an economic dimension. And I'm saying this because Elumelu, with his concept, partly addresses this in a very interesting way, and other people have taken up this question, obviously eventually arriving at different answers than somebody like Du Bois and people following him would. Let me now jump to a brief history of capitalism so that you get a better grasp of the idea. As I said, Tony Elumelu is a Nigerian billionaire. In 2011, he published a white paper in which he circumscribed this idea of Africapitalism. He was very successful in banking. He then took the money he made from banking and founded an investment firm, Hears Holding. He founded another conglomerate. So he's very active, and he has also gone into philanthropy and tries to foster entrepreneurship across the continent. To cite Edosi, Elumelu is representative of a new burgeoning capitalist class in Africa. Many of these representatives of this class actually benefited from privatization, deregulation, and other forms of state proximity, a fact which sometimes is conveniently withheld in more celebratory accounts of the rise of this capitalist class. What is interesting, however, is that many of these representatives of this class no longer exclusively depend on the state. They have become a considerable counterpower to state authority. They often became shapers of policies and social choices more generally. And I think providing this context is really important because it helps us to overcome an impasse that has characterized much of the critical development debate in the 70s and 80s, where this question loomed large: were African capitalists merely adjuncts to or appendages of foreign firms, primarily facilitating the operation of the latter, or were they an independent class capable of reshaping the domestic political economy by crowding out foreign capitalists by accumulating and reinvesting? So it really revisits the size, function, and agency of African capitalists. Well, the rise of African capitalist class is only one of the driving forces behind the proliferation of Africapitalism. Originally, Elumelu provided only a very shadowy outline of this idea, and this cited, for instance, here, Africapitalism, the primary goal is greater economic prosperity and social wealth, driven by Africa's private sector and its domestic economies, markets, and businesses. And then he supported academic research at the University of Edinburgh. Two prominent Nigerian academics further refined this idea of Africapitalism and provided some more philosophical underpinnings, an idea or an ideology that not only tries to do something different when it comes to the economy in Africa, sharing wealth, prosperity, and the fruits of accumulation, but there's a sense of progress and prosperity, a sense of parity, and a sense of peace and harmony that guides this kind of philosophy. So this is really, really important. Now, any observant student of Africa's history might find it puzzling that someone would so unashamedly embrace capitalism as the ideology of the future on a continent that has historically suffered most brutally under it, and which until today, by many accounts, does so. Recent work in the tradition of Afro-pessimism builds but extends this insight to actually make the claim that capitalism is anti-Black at its very core. And I think we can also jump to an interesting quote of Du Bois here. For 400 years, Europe and North America have built their civilization and comfort on the theft of colored labor and the land and materials which rightfully belong to these colonial peoples. The dominant exploiting nations are willing to yield more to the demands of the mass of men than were their fathers, but actually this is just a kind of sharing the loot and not stopping the loot approach. So this is very important. And outside the US and the UK context, it happens quite rarely that, you know, politicians openly embrace capitalism as an ideology. And on the African continent, many of the founding fathers and following generations of politicians have not dared to use capitalism as a, you know, word that is to be embraced. On the contrary, Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and many others touted it as un-African, neo-colonial, man eats man, or, you know, the colonizers' model of the world. I think the embrace of Africapitalism or the promotion also seems puzzling, given that capitalism has become increasingly questioned as an ideology and economic system that can really take us into the future. We had the financial crisis, we have all-time high global inequalities, we have climate change, we have the more and more obvious limits to growth that we are presented with. So it seems to be more and more hard to make a case for capitalism. We also had the COVID crisis, which in a way was linked to a kind of capitalist consumption model that, you know, makes certain pathogens crossing species. And we had this letter of 100 African intellectuals to African leaders, which really stipulated that the debt finance growth strategy that many African governments embraced over the past 15 years need to come to an end. And we have to think more about economy for the people than an economy of airports or large highways or shiny malls. So I think this is really important. But at the same time, it is not surprising that we have seen the proliferation of Africapitalism because of the rise of the capitalist class in Africa, and because also since the last financial crisis, the gaze of finance capital has been redirected towards Africa. We've all been hearing it, Africa as the last emerging market, or Africa rising, and some other narratives that have been circulating. And I think a last really important point is that we have seen a shift in development thinking where more and more philanthropic entities in the private sector are deemed to be the prime agents of economic change. So it is no coincidence that the mega rich of Africa, the African entrepreneurs, have also founded their own foundations, as you can see here. So I think this is some of the context you need to know to understand where the idea came from. And even though it seems to be a kind of unlikely emergence, it still kind of explains quite well why we have to deal with Africapitalism. So what kind of reconstruction does Africapitalism offer? And I borrow the term now from Du Bois, even though I don't do justice to his book by doing so. But I think we can fairly say that in a way, this represents an attempt to rethink how the economy works, whether it's an acceptable one or a sustainable one is another story, but I think we have to be fair here. So first, the idea of Africapitalism makes a very bold contribution to the African development debate. It really re-injects African agency into the development discourse. Many independence leaders were seriously committed to a politics of the future, philosopher presidents such as Nkrumah, Nyerere, Cabral, really creating long-term visions for their societies. This particular version of a politics of the future unfortunately faded away in the 1980s and onwards. Statist and homegrown academic visions of social transformation were gradually replaced with copy and paste structural adjustment practices. And until the early 2000s, I would argue African economies had even become greater importers of Euro-Atlantic concepts, something that has always in very intricate ways been part of the post-colonial experience, but now in a much, much more forceful way, I would say, because it was pushed by global economic institutions. The call for domesticating development, moving beyond imperial Western thought, overcoming the colonization of mind, language, as well as the more recent calls for Afrocentricity, Afro-consciousness, Afro-modernity, and Afro-communal leadership and Ubuntu economics. Some really interesting bridges emerge here between Africapitalism and these other calls. And this is why it resonates, I think, with a kind of broad range of groups at a surface level. And especially in newspaper writing, you see many of these things often being mixed up. I would say the idea of Africapitalism aligns with these other Africanisms as far as it posits that development in Africa should happen with a sense of place. It connects with the long-standing desire of African and African diaspora people to redefine their place in the world, and thus builds a bridge to Black capitalism debates in the US context. So this is really important, that this desire to reassert the place of Black communities in the world is one, of course, that has been shared with people across the whole political spectrum in the Black community, from left to conservative. But you can't do away with that desire, and that is why I think we should take it seriously and not just jump over it. Very, very interesting for me is that Africapitalism can also be related to the long-standing concept of Pan-Africanism, to which Du Bois is also quite central. But it comes across as globally more appealing, politically more neutral, given that Pan-Africanism has always had an anti-imperial and anti-capitalist ideological core. And I think Du Bois's work encapsulates this very well. In the piece you see here, interestingly, the author puts Elumelu in line with the likes of Du Bois. Broadly speaking, he argues that while the likes of Du Bois started Pan-Africanism as a cultural project, and African independence leaders transformed it into a political one, Africapitalism now heralds the economic phase of Pan-Africanism. I would not subscribe to this. I think Du Bois had cultural, political, and economic things in mind when he talked about Pan-Africanism, but it's interesting what the author makes of this. And Elumelu is a quintessential Pan-Africanist for him. And this is, of course, as I already alluded, a kind of different Pan-Africanism that Du Bois had in mind. I brought here a quote from his book on the world in Africa that was published in '58, at least this piece, because it's a collection of different writings. Can I just leave you to read it for a moment? So I think this is from the 6th Pan-African Congress in Accra, which was held, I think, in '55, and then later this was reprinted in '58, if I'm not mistaken. So he has an African audience here. Now, exactly what kind of critique does Africapitalism offer? What kind of critique of capitalism? And I'm soon to close. So first, it's a kind of liberal self-taming of Africapitalism, of capitalism, through the value-sharing actions of entrepreneurs who invest, who want to create social impact, who have a view on the local, who know their local environments, want to redistribute what they have produced. Eloumelu clearly defines entrepreneurs as key drivers of histories and positions the African model of Africapitalism against competing models, state-driven models in China, or the Chaebol model of South Korea, or the large family-based model of India. And for me, this is really interesting because we have moved in a way from philosopher presidents to intellectuals of capital, and Eloumelu is one African representative of this. Of course, there are many, many others. So he wants to use a better version of capitalism in a way to supersede actually existing capitalism, to remedy potential conflicts arising from jobless growth, accumulation by resource extraction, and increasing demographic pressures. He underlines that it is in capital's own interest to think long-term and invest for social impact. So it's really about creating a win-win machine. Of course, again, we could position now Du Bois's and other views here. This was a view from above. Once you have a more labor-centered view from below, then it is clear that capitalism has many contradictions and win-win situations. They exist in a way, but not for all, if you take a systemic view. And capitalism, including black capitalism from his perspective, is always exploitative. He clearly rejects mimicry and Booker T. Washington type of accommodation policies in his view from below. So I think this is really important to note once we bring in Du Bois. And another very important thing to note is that Eloumelu's take is a very microeconomic one. I mean, the state pops up somewhere, but it's really a microeconomic intervention to solve system level problems. And he shares this type of approach with many other intellectuals of capital, where more systemic factors that shape the production and unequal distribution of value, such as taxation systems, labor market arrangements, are discounted for. Again, we can move to Du Bois here and note that capitalism for him was not the solution, and neither was black capitalism. So again, briefly read out this quote. And then for me, it's really interesting to juxtapose this with a writing on black capitalism from James Box, 1970s, and you see certain similarities of critique here. So what I really take here from the Black Reconstruction on my reading of Africapitalism and the, you know, and digesting my own critical thoughts on this, is that a more general question emerges for me from this book, namely, how do elites, and I would count in Eloumelu there, even though he's a black representative of the elite in his own context, how do elites shape a racialized and class economic system in which system-threatening resistance has been built up in such ways that they can continue, more or less, with the status quo? Because this is exactly what had happened in the aftermath of the Civil War at the end of the 19th century, according to Du Bois's view. in the southern states and the US more generally. And I think it also is a valuable entry point into other geographic contexts, which are still part, in a way, of an economy shaped by white supremacist principles, or at least containing a great amount of them. To close here, what kind of future does Africapitalism imagine? What role does it assign to the state, to the citizenry, to the private sector? So here, for me, it's really interesting that Africapitalists promote a world where redistribution happens because of entrepreneurs' commitment to the idea of shared value, rather than, say, improved tax collection or other forms of redistribution. They are also devoted to the unlikely idea that bitter conflicts between labor and capital that the West has seen can be replaced on the African continent by capitalism informed by the humanistic solidarities of Ubuntu, broadly speaking, as a moniker for African values. But if you dig deeper, it still builds on a kind of coloniality. It's not undoing it, and we can really contrast it with, the kind of reconstruction Du Bois had in mind from his autobiography here. He pleaded for communism. I dropped the word here and just left this other part here of the quote. He promoted a planned way of life in the production of wealth and work designed for building a state whose object is the highest welfare of its people and not merely the profit of a part. So I think this is really important, and it's worth revisiting this quote and opening up our imagination. What could this mean in practice? And the last point, how does Africapitalism tackle Africa's most pressing problems? I'm very careful here what I identify as a problem, but I think if we read, books like Ndlovu Kacheni's recent book, Material and Cognitive Extraversion is, in my view, and in his, a big problem. Jobless growth, poverty and unemployment, growing inequalities between Africa and the world, as well as between different social groups in Africa as well, and environmental issues, first and foremost, but not reducible to climate change. So I've just selected these. And what does Africapitalism has to offer here? As I said, sharing wealth, first investing, long-term view, local orientation, Pan-Africanism, then share the wealth, is one of the major recipes here. And then you have these competitions where you groom the next generation of entrepreneurs who can spin the entrepreneurial wheel to exactly achieve this. And I think it's worth to compare this reconstruction with alternative economic reconstructions. A book like Afrotopia by Senegalese economist Felwine Sarr, or this Audacity to Disrupt report by a group of feminist African economists, where they bring in an explicitly feminist perspective to rethink how economies could work, but also a more macroeconomic perspective, something that is often missing in the writing of Elumelu, or this recent Dakar Declaration in the spirit of the Arusha Declaration, a group of academics, African and beyond Africa, social movements representatives, activists, etc., recently published this declaration. So I think it's really worth re-engaging with these alternative reconstructions. As a conclusion, a critique, as I have offered, of Africapitalism does not deny the need for Africans and the African diaspora to advance more humane, place-based and connected economies that try to radically transcend capitalism as we have known it. In a Du Boisian spirit, I really think we should ask ourselves how to reconstruct the economy so that it breaks radically with the system shaped by white supremacy, exploitative labor practices, and environmental destruction. Does Africapitalism achieve this? I think I have demonstrated a few points why not. Guess there are more points than this, but this is the spirit I'm taking from reading the Black Reconstruction as far as I could. And this then entails really a move from the kind of dull promotion of Afrocentric entrepreneurship as a kind of Africanized Silicon Valley type of model to a more serious examination of the fundamental nature of the system that we are attacking and that we are trying to build, to cite James Box. I'm closing here. Apologies for stepping over with the time, and looking forward to the debate and Kimari's talk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ouma. That was a fantastic presentation, and we'll now turn it over to Dr. Kimari. Those of you who have been typing questions into the chat, thank you very much. Into Q&A, please continue doing that, and we'll field them at the end of the two talks. So, Dr. Kimari, the floor is yours.
Asante sana Yusuf. Ndugu Stefan, can you stop sharing? Pole, so that I can share.
Pole.
Hakuna shida. Thank you, and I really appreciate your talk. Maybe I'm kind of naive, but I didn't know there were so many proponents of African capitalism, which is quite hard against the realities that we are facing. But thank you so much for sharing that, Stefan. I'm also going to try and share my screen. And then I do slideshow. So thank you all. And really, I think it's important to say thank you so much, Yusuf and your team, for creating space where we can think about African geographies across all of these different continents and what we can learn from each other. And I really hope that this collaboration can grow so that we can, as was done a lot by people like Du Bois, talk with it a lot more than I think is happening now. So my talk today, which is a really humble contribution to try and think through Du Bois and the powerful figure of the Black worker through the struggling people of Nairobi. My talk is called Reconstructing the Native City, and I would like to talk about Africans who are never meant to be in the city of Nairobi, and which was really constructed as a white city, but what they did to survive and endure from the colonial period to the present. And this manifested itself through diverse habitations of the city that were always proscribed. Even now, they're still proscribed, but that still allows for a reclamation and a reconstruction of their city, the native city. So against all of the many evictions, all of the flooding, all of the police brutality, many of these communities that were historically the native city are somehow still grasping onto their little spaces and engaging in habitation practices that allow them to reconstruct consistently the native city. And just to make sure everyone can see the screen, yeah? I'm a bit of a dinosaur, so I really hope.
Yes, we can all see the screen. Thank you.
Okay, great. And so to get to this, I will talk briefly about the work that led me to think about housing and the native city and habitation. I'll talk about Nairobi and the history of Nairobi and the kind of logics that let it still continue as a place, as a colonial space. Following that, I'll focus on a specific settlement, and the picture you're seeing now, if I can just move this. The picture you're seeing now of Mathare and the kind of inhabitations that have endured here. And then, so to start it's good to get acquainted with Nairobi. If you Google Nairobi now, you don't have to, but one of the first images you'll see, if I can just move, is this. This is the official propaganda of Nairobi. You have a giraffe. People really, our government really wants you to be close to giraffes. You have boring buildings, and you have colonial architecture that's resplendent in all the ways that it was trying to be inviolate. And so this is the official propaganda of Nairobi. And I'm not saying that this doesn't exist, but for many, this is the reality of Nairobi, where 60% of Nairobi dwellers, excuse me, live in places like this in Mathare without basic sanitation, without, above all, claims like 10-year security, and a government that is invested in ignoring it because even from the post-colonial period, these settlements that were formerly the native city were seen as a stain on our modernity, on our aspirations to be a new African modern state. But it's these contradictions of this Nairobi and this Nairobi that endures that led me for my PhD to make 3 principles. And that also led me to consistently try and sit in the discomfort that is Nairobi, in the apartheid that is Nairobi, to try and like Du Bois, re-narrativize the city, or the tale of the Black worker, to put forward their stories, their accounts of what transpired. And so this led me to make 3 principal arguments in my PhD. First, that urban planning in Nairobi is a colonial assemblage that is territorialized by racialized and colonial ideas and practices for ecology, politics, society, and economics. And this allows for spatial management or urban administration of neglect and force, and produces geographies of despair, of multiple exclusions that I was calling ecologies of exclusion. The second argument I made was that there's a militarization of urban space that reinforces this colonial neglect and force, allowing that the police become de facto urban infrastructure and managers. But despite this, like the Black worker, who's consistently reconstructing and having a revolution from below, like Stefan was saying, and pursuing a different imagination for the city. Despite this, people within ecologies of exclusion plot escapes, recalibrations, fugitive survivals that change not just their lives, but the futurities of the city. And so the democracy that enslaved people were reconstructing was not just for them, but it was for the whole country. Just like the contestations that city dwellers in Nairobi, marginalized city dwellers in Nairobi are waging, ultimately are not just for them, but for the whole city. And it's important to think about how did we get here? Before I also start talking about fugitive in Habitations. Just briefly, and this is recognizing that you all know this history, and I'm also offering it in a very blunt way. Sorry, actually, before I get there, I just wanted to say that one of the framings that that come out of my PhD work is this recognition of marginalized dwellers as outlaws. And in saying that they're outlaws, this registers that they're pushed outside of the law, so they have no recourse in the law. They're not considered in the law, even if we have a new 2010 constitution that puts has a Bill of Rights that should guarantee people the right to water, right to adequate housing, the right to life. They don't have this recourse, as we can see, by convention, even if the law is there. So they're pushed outside of the law, and they're continuously criminalized, whether it's by arresting or whether it's surveillance and harassment, as well as disconnecting the efforts that they have to get electricity or water, for example. And so for me, these outlaws are I read them also as similar, although they were not in in a plantation economy, as also the Black worker whose struggles change the course of history. So how did we get to the Nairobi that's Nairobi today? Very briefly, there was the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, where 14 countries, including the US and even countries like Denmark, met in Germany to basically divide Africa, even if the ostensive motivation was civilization and trade. And certainly there were many incursions, imperial incursions before, in South Africa, in Zanzibar. There are always British, people who were sent and were negotiating with different communities, ostensibly negotiating before. But this conference consolidated the supposed ownership of these imperial powers of certain African geographies. And so Kenya became formally British. And this, subsequent to this process, it became known as it became governed by the Imperial British East African Company. And through railways and religion and rifles, it was really a British colony. And so the Imperial British East African Company, equal to the East India Company, then to try and get commercial interest, because it was a commercial company from this geography that came to be known as Kenya later, decided to build a railway. And this railway, because of really, the railway was being built because Kenya has a coastline, Mombasa, and so the British could then get goods or whatever it was trading, supposedly trading with the Kingdom of Buganda, out to England easier. And so Nairobi fit into this halfway point between Uganda and Mombasa. But not only that, it provided a high altitude, so there were no mosquitoes, but also cool waters that would allow for workers to, I don't know if they really wanted to give water to anyone else, but it would allow for water to serve the machinations of this imperial enterprise. And so really Nairobi is an accidental colonial geography, because it was in this halfway point, and from its beginnings as a railway town, as we can see from the picture above, but even prior to that, the initial tents that were set up by the white people, the South Asian laborers who were brought to build the railway, as well as the African porters, that initial setup of the tents already was imprinting the landscape with a racial segregation. And so Nairobi emerges from being a railway town, and then soon becomes a protectorate when the IBAC, or the Imperial British East Africa Company, cedes now powers to the British government. The railway they made was called the Lunatic Express, because it was not generating the revenues that it needed to pay for itself. And so the company then cedes operations to the British government. And so slowly by slowly, then the administration of Nairobi is not through a company, but is through settler colonialism. And early on, segregation was conventional, even if it wasn't always in law. And so, but it was in around the late, incrementally, laws were made to keep Africans out of the city. And this was through employment ordinances that said Africans couldn't be in the city if they didn't have work. Also, just restricting the land that Africans could stay in, restricting the housing there was for workers. And so in these ways, Africans were really limited from being in the city. But still, they're here. This is Mathare, the settlement I was talking about. And Mathare emerged as a stone quarry. So really Africans began by settling in the cave dwellings that emerged from the gorged out rock. And there are all of these laments in the colonial record of Africans having parties, of settling where they shouldn't settle, of staying longer than their economic permits allowed, of building houses of mud and cardboard when there were standards. So there were all of these laments that we can see in the colonial archive that were seeking to document but also deal with these African habitations. And it was only, one example of this you can see of registering Africans there was from the African habitation was from the annual report of 1911 and also 1912 that talks about some of the dwellings that Africans were having. And here, unfortunately, they talk about native prostitutes because perhaps African women who were in the city and not in the rural areas were read through this lens that they were degenerate and detribalized African women. And this African report talks about how, as we can see, on the borders of the swamp, several houses, some of which are occupied by laborers on the various shambas, and some by native prostitutes who pay rent to the Indian owners. And so there was this really misrecognition of African inhabitation, and also the including talking about how African houses were, as Ambo says, just scattered in nondescript fashion along meandering footpaths. So there was this misrecognition. But even when Africans who were employed were built houses by the state, and this is not all of them, they were built like this, and this is an estate called Ziwani. They were built, and according to Anderson, in standards that no European would have wanted to live in. And this looks like one house, but it's actually a two-roomed house. And for people who had families, who had wives, who had kids, this housing was really, it didn't work, and it didn't have the services that Europeans had. It's important to note that this housing itself was seen beyond being the responsibility of the government or European firms in the city to house their natives, and for which I think less than 10% had access to these houses. These houses were also seen as a corrective, as a way to shape African comportment towards a more European domesticity, with kitchens built in a certain way that perhaps don't allow charcoal cooking, with toilets that may have been inside. And so these houses, besides, they were also seen as a way to offer corrective and to try, as little as they were, as much as the standards were so bad, to try and prevent Africans who didn't have houses in the city from rising up. And this question about housing continued to gain a lot more traction in the post-war Second World War period, where people were concerned that Africans who were demobilized from the war were coming back for fighting in a war that were not theirs, would come back with these skills and then raise all of these concerns. And there was reference to a strike in Mombasa with port workers that happened in 1949 or so, and a general strike in Nairobi in 1950, as having arisen from these concerns as well, not just labor and not just settler colonialism, but housing. And putting forward these concerns in 1944 was a lord in the British Parliament who writes the following. He put forward a motion called, I think the motion is called East and West Africa Housing Problems. And his concern was what would happen when these Africans were demobilized in Lagos, in Freetown, but also in Nairobi. And here he says, the position in Nairobi is entirely different, but in some respects even more unsatisfactory. The African settlement there, as many of your lordships no doubt know, are most unpalatable places consisting largely of shacks, overcrowded to a degree which is unbelievable, in which no building has taken place and very little has been allowed because of the restrictions on the type of buildings which may be put up there imposed by the Nairobi municipality. And no doubt with the best intentions in the world, obviously not to us, but they have laid down certain rules for permanent buildings, which are of course quite unfulfillable in the time of war. So not only were the restrictions on Africans living in the city engendering these housing limits and concerns, but also the cost of building materials and also the standards that were imposed for housing in the city. So you couldn't really build a house of mud or thatch. And so collectively, this led to a situation where there was not enough housing. And so places like Mathare thrived. And it was these kind of settlements that made European or the colonial government fear uprisings from Africans or from natives. And this fear really materialized in the colonial period. And before I get there, we can see some of these concerns in reports like the City Council of Nairobi report that talks about how, and also indicates fugitive habitations, how in Pumwani on one night, 482 natives were found sleeping in 11 houses, capable of accommodating 163. Natives huddled together under whatever shelter was available. And so you can see Africans living overcrowded ways, in not letting the colonial government know when their when their jobs were finished, in just staying in the city and, according to the colonial government, living in their wits. So this is just one example of the different fugitive ways they found to try and stay in the city. But the fears of this African uprising were materialized when in the late, or came really to their worst imaginations of the colonial government, happened when in the late 1940s and early 1950s, there was increasing anti-colonial agitation across the country. And so in 1952, the colonial government declared a state of emergency. And this led to lots of surveillance in the city, demolitions in Mathare in 1953, but also in 1954, a large-scale raid called Operation Anvil that saw the whole of the native city, and we can see here, really surrounded by barbed wire. People woke up at 5 a.m. and they were enclosed in this barbed wire. And Anderson talks about how they could only get out of the city on the back of a lorry that was brought to, or their areas that was brought to their site by the colonial government. And so there was a lot more surveillance, which in some ways made sense, because when Mathare, the Operation Anvil was launched in Mathare, and the whole community was cleared, unfortunately, particularly the people who corresponded to ethnic groups that were seen as more likely to join Mau Mau. When Mathare was cleared, they found guns, they found evidence of African courts, lots of evidence of people taking oaths against the government. And so their fears about housing, but also African habitations, really were materialized. And so here's a picture of women who were being questioned during the emergency period and being put in this enclosed space. We can see here also the kinds of surveillance that were happening throughout the city, where you had to walk around with your pass and your identification document. And this was what was happening in the city because of this fear of African inhabitation. Unfortunately, in the post-colonial period in 1964, when Africans finally came back to the city, or were allowed to live in the city without, of course, with class limitations, the very same process of evictions were happening. And I'll just make sure, sorry that I'm not going so late. Yusuf, I can't, okay.
You're
sorry,
fine.
that was, okay, good. I couldn't see the chat. But unfortunately, in 1964, these very same conditions or this very same insecurity transpired. This is a picture from a British Pathé video documenting evictions and in 1964, 1 year after independence in 1963. You can see the city council dressed in very, very colonial outfits, standing on someone's house and demolishing the house that was made with the labor of the Black worker. And strangely, against these demolitions, there were also both post-colonial promises as well, despite these evictions. Here's a newspaper article from 1969 with very problematic language talking about how houses have been pledged to people in Mathare and how they would soon get houses because the government cared for them. But on the other side of this slide, we can see a demolition notice from 1979 that's telling people to move and how the city council intends to demolish houses and will accept no claims or responsibility for property or materials damage because houses of proper standards that were considered legitimate by the county would be built. And in 1970, the really cognizant of the continuity of a colonial governance of the city, about 30,000 Mathare residents wrote to the city council, and they had a question in that letter, which is posted here and also further reproduced in another slide coming. But the question was, their question was, now this is our question. Why has the government and the city council forgotten us? We do pay taxes and no law now has kept us out of Nairobi. We do vote and have always been loyal citizens of Kenya. The letter also says, and it's a letter from 1970, may we appeal to you on behalf of the 30,000 residents of Mathare Valley and all the growing numbers of unemployed in Nairobi and other squatter villages who cannot afford high rents to help us improve our villages now, rather than to burn us out or to continue to wait until we all have jobs, which may never happen. And so as you can see, the native city was consistently under threat, not just in the colonial period, where it was seen as an African threat, but in the post-colonial period, where it was seen as this stain against the aspiring modern city. And this is also the case of, really has happened because of a perpetuation from that time of a Black capitalism. And so for people like Monica Nduku, who is is a auntie, a very kind Mathare dweller who has lived in Mathare from, I think she was born in 1962 and her parents came in 1952 during the emergency period. Nothing has changed, really. She still lives in a house without much tenure security. This is probably her 10th house in her life, at least, because she's been evicted, she couldn't pay rent, house has been demolished. There's been a fire, post-election violence led to the burning of her house. And so she's always had to reconstruct her home and reconstruct life here in ways that tell us so much about the reinstantiating coloniality of the city. So this is her outside of her house in December this year. And you can see habitation practices are happening that try and always reconstruct lives. For example, the corrugated iron on her house, you can see has been repurposed many times, maybe because of fire. there's a chicken, even if there's still bylaws in the city, colonial bylaws that that prescribe the keeping of, for example, chickens in urban areas. But she's still trying to keep the city, her life alive and reconstruct her place in the city. And so she lives here now with her grandchildren, one of whom was shot by the police, just trying in different fugitive ways within enclosed spaces, like Sojourner says, to try and stake a claim to this city that has never really been that of the Black worker or that of the outlaw. And how she survived, like her friends who came, she has a friend who I spoke to who came here in 1948. They survived through convivialities, through just building houses again after fires, or through protests, through helping each other, through raising chickens, through building houses from whatever they can, through cooking alcohol, through just inhabiting the city in fugitive ways. And despite looming evictions, as we can see, one picture here depicting a recent eviction, and despite, and there is actually a talk of a new road being built in March, and there's lots of community fear about the road. In this picture, you can see an earlier road that was built and led to evictions. Despite these looming evictions, this family, like Monica and Duku, may move deeper into the settlement or elsewhere across the settlement or to other native cities in this town. And they continue the work as others before of reconstructing the native city. So thank you, and I will stop now.
Thank you very much, Wangui. Oh, fantastic talk. You've left us with lots to think about, and we'll invite our colleague and comrade, Dr. Ouma, back to join us for a conversation. A number of you have been posting your questions into the Q&A, and please continue to do that. But to get us started, we'll invite our two speakers maybe to open up the Q&A by asking each other a question. So whichever of you would like to go first, please go ahead.
Stefan, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Wangui. I mean, I've been to Mathare myself some time ago, and I was always interested in the place, and I really appreciate your scholarship, and I know you're very well grounded in the space. If you would juxtapose your own scholarship about a place such as Mathare in the Kenyan environment, and how people have done research on informal settlements and spaces such as Mathare, but also in the larger landscape of scholarship, because Kenya is one of the hotspots of this type of scholarship. What is different in your case, just to bring it, flesh it out a little bit more for the audience?
Thank you, Stefan. I'm trying to answer this in a way that doesn't make it the Wangui show, because I don't want it to be the Wangui show. But I would say that a lot of scholarship on Kenyan settlements has really traded in language that is not so grounded. There's a lot of focus on informality without looking at the historical roots of structural violence. My new worst word is also resilience. There's a lot of focus on resilience and adaptation. And also the UN trades in this narrative that people who live in the city are new, that Africa is full of rural-urban migration. But these are generations of people who've been displaced in the city consecutively, even by Black governments who came to power and then named their child Uhuru, but there's no Uhuru for anyone, you know? And so my hope, my very humble hope, although I also fail miserably as like a middle-class researcher, is to try and center these narratives of the city that challenge formal spatial management narratives, that resists a very apolitical resilience or NGO interventions that don't recognize the colonial continuities of the present. So I don't know. That's just my very humble attempt. But these are communities that are long lasting, but people don't want, even the interventions that talk about resilience, or even the UN, don't recognize, I think intentionally, the generational displacements that happen here. That's intentional. It's not benign, and it's not they're the collateral of both white supremacy and African capitalism, but that recognition is not there. They're just misrecognized as people who should not be in the city. And I mean, other deviant framings.
Thank you, Asante.
My question for you actually is actually quite simple, because I feel it's geriatric men of a certain generation who perpetuate Africapitalism. It's very, whereas young people who embody a class, not just because of by virtue of their demography or how large they are, but really in material conditions, young people in Africa are a class. I don't think they're, and not to generalize, I don't think they're perpetuating this narrative. And so I wonder what it is about this generation of men, maybe, and no offense to anyone of that generation who's listening, but I feel that there's something particular about that class and generation, or maybe I'm generalizing too much. So that's just my question to you.
Yeah, thank you, Wangui. Maybe I respond by starting with a Twitter quote from 2014 by an African tweeter. I don't know which country he hailed from, maybe Nigeria. He's saying Africapitalism is an idiotic formulation by a few robber barons. It's a rootless ideology. This was a younger person. Yet, if you look at YouTube videos by Elumelu, and there are so many by now, you have hundreds of comments, and you really get an impression that also the younger generation looks up to the guy. But we also know there's a sample bias with social media, and the youth population is so much larger, of course, in many African countries. So for me, to be honest, empirically, I'm yet to find out how it really resonates with the larger public, because especially with social media, you know, this entrepreneurial mindset, it has become more popular, and you have these TV shows, and across geographical regions, young people have bought into this more liberal to bordering the libertarian type of ideology. So I'm not really sure how much widespread it would be. If you had a poll on, 1,000 people, Kenya, Nigeria, Tanzania, and you would show them a small clip of Elumelu, and you also try to have a kind of mixed sample, how many positive responses you would get? I'm uncertain. Now move to the US. We look at Jay-Z and Beyonce, the black billionaire couple in a way. How many positive responses would we get across the different kinds of black communities you might get? I'm not sure. My feeling is that many would have a kind of aspirational response and say, oh, these people made it. We also want to achieve this. But as you said, once you bring in people who are really grounded in a class position, of course, they will be more skeptical. Yeah, but that is why I would say we need a stratified sample if we do a poll.
Thank you,
yeah.
Stefan.
But it's a very good question, because the danger is also that we succumb to this social media hype and then make something larger than it actually is. Yeah, so there is a danger there as well.
Thank you. We've got a couple questions here we can start with from Isaac, who asks, Stefan, I believe, do you think that Africapitalism in its current framework amounts to sharing the loot and not stopping the loot as you set out with Du Bois? Or would you describe Africapitalism as mimicking or accommodatory of capitalism? Again, drawing from Du Bois's anti-capitalist stance. And then for Wangui, the question is, are there any corporate interests in the evictions in Mathare settlements, or is it just in pursuit of government infrastructural goals like the roads you spoke of that's driving these evictions? So could you elaborate on what interests mediate these displacements?
Yeah, thank you, Isaac, for the question. I mean, first I have to say you can put so many different types of ventures into the Africapitalism box because it's such a malleable category. So a company like Nakumatt, a former large Kenyan supermarket that has collapsed, was part of a good, what was heralded as a good example for Africapitalism. M-Pesa, Safaricom, where the Kenyan government has a huge 30% stake. This can be framed as Africapitalism. What you see when you look at those cases, there's always some kind of foreign partner involved. So it may look like a domestication of value creation, but then these companies often have ties to foreign shareholders. So again, it is sharing the loot, but it's also maybe to some extent domesticating it. But then you always have to look closer, because domesticating the value extraction does not mean that this value flows back to the larger public via taxes being paid or via any other kind of physical arrangements. It can still be, going to a relatively small group of people. So just because you have a domestic capitalist in charge does not mean automatically that the larger communities would benefit. And that is why I also would make a call for concrete empirical investigation. Okay, now let's take some of these examples we have been given as good Africapitalism stories and look closely at their business model and how they work. And then we can arrive at a conclusion about the value of what they say. Yeah, I think I would stop here.
Thanks, Stefan. And in terms of corporate interests, Mathare is really close to the city. At this point, it's less than 3 kilometers away, and consequently, the land value, even if it was seen as what Wright calls a deficit geography for a long time because it was low-lying floodplain, I still actually I think is one of, if not the lowest lying level poor urban settlement in the city, but it still is close to the city, and there's the land prices of land have gone up high. It's close enough so that if you were to build apartments or formal tenements, that people would get really inordinate rents from that. And so there are those interests. There's also there's now a renewed bid. There's always every few years a renewed bid to clean the Nairobi River, because Nairobi has a very complex river system, and most neighborhoods have a river system. And in particular, poor urban settlements usually have a river intersecting them because people could use the water for their own domestic purposes, whether it was for houses or to cook alcohol. And so there's a new UN-supported commission to rehabilitate this river so that we can have recreational spaces. But those recreational spaces don't recognize, or those proposals don't want to recognize, that there are people already living there, but instead they want to have these very elite venues for recreation by the river. And so there are these multifaceted corporate interests in Mathare, besides the road, which is also part of corporate interests, but the housing, because there's always a shortage of housing and people don't, the biggest investment is to make middle-class housing and not housing for the poor. And also these auxiliary concerns for ostensive concerns for the environment, which really want to create recreational spaces for the elite.
Mm.
Thank you. I want to ask you both, and before I do, I want to invite people again, please type your questions into the Q&A. All questions are welcome. They're coming in and they're great. I want to ask Stefan a question about land. Du Bois places a lot of emphasis on the kind of possibilities of land redistribution during Reconstruction that were ultimately foreclosed. And he seems to imply that had land distribution really occurred on a broader scale, it would have meant potentially a greater balance of power between a kind of agrarian focused economy on the one hand and a kind of industrial and financial economy on the other hand, rather than what he says became the result of the defeat of Reconstruction, which is the dominance of industrial capitalism over agriculture, and eventually the dominance of finance capital over all the others, and the resulting kind of inter-imperialist rivalries and wars that Wangui touched on, right? The Berlin Conference, eventually World War I. So you work on land and on farming. So I'm curious if you see that there's a way in which land today and land redistribution in Africa could potentially constitute an alternative economic model to Africapitalism. And then for Wangui, you know, in your fantastic article, Imperial Remains, where you argue for a centering of race in East African infrastructures, you make a really strong argument that the Black radical tradition needs to be returned to Africa, retranslated to Africa, as you put it really nicely. And so I'm curious, you've given us some examples of that, I think, in your talk about Fugitive and Habitations of the city, which were really powerful. Sometimes it's not clear to us, in those of us reading and trying to work in the Black radical tradition, what it is exactly, what it looks like. And so I think your presentation touched on two examples that also builds on some of what Du Bois talks about, as you said, with regards to making the city from below, paralleling it to the general strike, and potentially a kind of more fugitive example of the Black radical tradition through the story of that particular woman and the way she's rebuilt her home multiple times, what some urban scholars have called the quiet encroachment of the city potentially. And on the other hand, your work with Mathari Social Justice Center, which seems to be a more formal, organized, radical attempt to inhabit and rebuild and reclaim the city. So I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit more of a sense of how you understand this Black radical tradition, different inhabitations of it, enactments of it, different degrees of organization that are present in it in Nairobi, just like Du Bois talks about the kind of more spontaneous general strike versus more formalized forms of organization that were occurring during Reconstruction.
Yeah, thank you, Yusuf, for this really interesting question. I mean, Du Bois makes that point, or we can deduct from his work this one statement about the 40 acres and a mule. So imagine the economic history of the United States if every freed man and woman from the Black community back then would have been given 40 acres and a mule as a technology of the day, in terms of accumulation and progress happening in the community then over a longer period of time. And this has been reintroduced into reparation debates in the US context by a few Black economists. So land plays a really central role, but for Du Bois, but also different forms of capital. There are the planters, there's industrial capital, there are white laborers who became petty capitalists, and there are then the potential Black capitalists. Africa is really diverse in terms of the land situation, and settler colonies, former settler colonies such as Kenya, obviously the land question is quite a different one. And maybe I zoom into Kenya because I can connect it very well to Du Bois's work. So for me, the central question from his work is, what were the possibilities after the end, or after, not the full end, but after the real breakdown of a highly exploitative and racialized economic system in a certain context? And you can transfer this to Kenya, for instance. What space did the first independence government in Kenya have to redistribute land, to tackle the highly skewed land distribution in Kenya? And what was the actual trajectory? And then we see that it was not just a very tribalized type of approach to land distribution, but also a very elite-focused one. And this has remained with us until today, that elites of Kenya have a huge interest in maintaining the land tenure system as it is, because they have so many stakes in it, including the first president's family, which is the largest landowner in the country. So for me, the question then that emerges is always, okay, an economy could be constructed in that way, but whose interests would be then targeted, and what would they do to prevent the kind of uprising that would threaten their interests? And I think you can apply this to many different contexts and then start your investigation and dig a little bit deeper, but you cannot come up with a general answer across Africa because the land tenure systems are so different despite certain shared colonial histories.
And thank you, Yusuf. I hope I got your question right. For me, I use the Black radical tradition, even if there's so much I need to read, for many reasons. First, because we also need to understand African context as racialized context, and where race is still center, even if we talk about post-coloniality. And we can see that in the legacies of space in Nairobi, where the native city is still the area where the government is seeing prostitutes, like in the 1911 and 12 report. It's still the geography that doesn't have water. And those are racial legacies. And so for me, I think a lot of our scholarship has done us a disservice by not recognizing that, but also because there's so many parallel situations. Flint, Michigan doesn't have water the same way Mathare doesn't have water. And that's really, there's so much we can learn from the resistance to those processes in both spaces, but the structural violence enacted in both of those spaces. I think try and use the Black radical tradition also because of my Pan-African leanings, but also because, and I don't mean to be a rude millennial, but our people can't be informal forever. There's so many limited descriptors that we use for African residents as informal or incremental, and we open this up once we dive into a tradition that recognizes their agency in different ways rather than limited in official discourse. And so I think that's important. And how do I see the Black radical tradition happening? I don't think, and in the context of the research I do, and also the presentation, the raid that I talked about in 1954, even if those women were put, they were enclosed in barbed wire, the whole geography, 3 kilometers was enclosed in barbed wire. As they got out of that space, they were spitting in the faces of the colonial officers. And so even if they were in closed spaces, they had limited agency, they took that moment to enact a radical action that would, however small, shape, as Du Bois says, shape not just democracy, independence, space, it would shape so many things. And so you can see that happening in so many different ways. And I think it's important to put those actions within a larger tradition of all African peoples resisting different violations of their lives. And I think this allows for possibilities of solidarity, of parallel reflections, and also possibilities for organizing, and even allowing for more grounded, I think, and more polysemic understandings of ourselves, rather than the African informal worker being the main figure in African urban scholarship forever. But again, I just want to emphasize that we need to also recognize race more in our context and the legacies of that, even if we're a settler colonial situation, and maybe the Black radical tradition reflects more on the plantation economies or experiences of enslavement. But I do think that there are so many parallels and openings and necessities for us to think together that tradition.
Fantastic. Thanks to you both for those answers. We have a question for Wangui from Damien Sojourner. It says, thank you so much for your insightful analysis that map out the many contradictions within settlement planning. My question is regards to the ontological origins and development of fugitive action. Specifically, what is the ontological orientation of a particular type of Black fugitivity within the specificity of Kenya, within the context of how it departs, is in tension, and pushes beyond the Western settlement schemes? And then for Stefan, we have a question from our comrade and fellow economic geographer, Tu Lan, who has asked, oh, wait a second, I think his question disappeared here. I will, okay.
Because I answered it with.
Oh, you answered it. Okay, I'm going to ask it here just so the audience can hear, and then maybe they can hear a little bit of your answer. Tu has says here, fantastic presentations from both of you. Thank you so much. To Stefan, has any of the African national local governments taken up the discourse of Africapitalism and put it into policy practice? And he says the celebration of entrepreneurialism resonates with similar discourses in China that have been integrated into policymaking. Has the same happened in any country in Africa?
Yeah, thank you for this comment. So I think until today, many African governments don't like to use the word capitalism. So they have been careful. In some constitutions, like in Tanzania, socialism is still enshrined as the official, and even the first development plan of Kenya in 65 had African socialism. This is hard to believe as the ideology of the country, but that's a side story. So I have not seen it implemented directly, but these events are there. They are shining. Elumelu is a Pan-African player. He's a big man. He's hosted by presidents. So of course his concept resonates with those in power. And maybe to close with a note from a Kenyan technocrat, when I sent him my paper on Africapitalism, he said, your critique, it's fair. I see your points, but at least Elumelu got us to discuss ideology. And what did this man want to say with this? He alluded to a problem that even left progressive thinkers like Mbembe have flagged in the past, that we have abandoned the politics of the future. So the first generation presidents in Africa, think of them what you want, but at least they needed to think about where their societies want to move to. They were often writing books, they were intellectuals and whatnot. And we have abandoned that track. Some presidents are proud to say, I don't read books. I think Wangui knows the one I'm talking about. And now you have Elumelu, you know, and you may not agree with his concept, but at least we're having this debate on ideology, which can open many other doors. So I found that a very pragmatic and interesting point by the person.
And thank you, Damien, for your question. I think for many young people in Mathare, because Mathare, as it didn't come out so much here, but really was an urban center for anti-colonial struggle. And so for many young people, even if they're still struggling to erase years of being told you're just a criminal, you're just a deviant, you're just degenerate, not only because you're African, but you're African poor, they're really reaching for this Mau Mau legacy. And in fact, Mathare is the only place in Kenya to date that has a Mau Mau road that recognizes the independence fighters or the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. And this is 60 plus years after independence. And so this shows the identification that people have, even if they've been years of no education and miseducation and being told that mothers just give birth to prostitutes and criminals and that their wombs are problematic and always being criminalized and annihilated. Really, the rates of extrajudicial killings are so high in Mathare. There's a really fervent bid by young people to create socialities like environmental groups and youth groups that, besides being a material praxis, are also an immaterial praxis to reclaim themselves as Mau Mau, to reconfigure for themselves an identity of being a nature that's otherwise from that which they have been told. And so at the same time, we're still a colonial country, and so we are still grappling with the civilizatory bids of the British for 100 plus years, and that shapes our interiorities in many ways that are full of contradictions. But certainly it's in places like Mathare, much more than in the boring retiree colony where I live, that people are demanding that they think anew of themselves and of their communities. So I hope really, I mean, it's not in perfect ways. I'm not here to romanticize Mathare. It's a very difficult place for many people, but certainly it's a place where these bids to assert a different subjecthood than that people have been told are very strong there. And you can see that as it translates to the landscape, as young people create they help each other rebuild houses, and they create parks in a place that's an apartheid geography. And so you can see these bids for subjecthood that are otherwise from that they've been told, and that have a political question and pursue a political being and nature and question. I hope that attends in some way to your question.
That was great. Thank you. We have another question from Damien for Stefan here, building off the question on land. In many respects, your discussion of Africapitalism is forecasting the logics of late capitalism, similar to Du Bois's forewarning of the colossal pitfalls of capital's co-optation of freedom during Reconstruction. Are there Africapitalist models pertaining to land that portend for regions around the world? So kind of, is there a similar co-optation going on with regards to land right now vis-a-vis Africapitalism? And then there was a question or two questions for Wangui that we might be able to combine. I'll try to read them slowly if that's possible. One from Mariel Rowland that says, "Hi Wangui, you used the phrase accidental colonial geography. Could you talk about this a little more and why it is significant to what's going on today? Does the accidental formation shape the fugitive modes you describe? Do the failures in the railway to generate revenue create the cracks in spatial control, which then are held open by Native people in their reorganization?" And then I think somewhat parallel to that, Lan has asked you, can you tell us more about the land policy and urban governance structure in Kenya? Is Mathare currently an official administrative unit with its own local government? Is the government elected? If it is, does this government receive its share of local taxes? what's the relationship between local and central governments in Kenya? Sorry, I have too many questions, he said, but they're all great. So we'll turn it over to you. Hopefully that's not too overwhelming.
Yeah, thank you for this great set of questions. I mean, pertaining to land, I would differentiate between Africapitalists from below and from above. From below, these are, you know, business savvy, real estate people or farmers, digital farmers, as we may call them in Kenya, some of whom have left their former banking careers and just, you know, consider farming to be a real business and buy land and expand. And so these people, they are not driven by a kind of ideology template, but they are still capitalists and they have a footprint. So in the urban and rural economy, so of course we have a kind of, you know, burgeoning middle type of capitalist class that is a real driver to reckon with, and we forget about these players sometimes if we just focus on the 1%. But then you have the Africapitalists from above, somebody like Tony Elumelu, Dangote, and others. So first, they have serious urban real estate interest. They are involved in all kinds of financing vehicles and real estate plays and whatnot. So of course, they are linked to urban land, and their ideology is connected to that in a way or another. But they have also ventured into agriculture, sometimes really big new farms, sugar farms, and whatnot. They are investing in, and you always have to ask where's the land coming from. What you won't find is, if you look into Tony Elumelu's white paper of 2011, that there's an explicit policy component for land, like in a African Development Bank report or something. You won't find that, but still many players breathing that spirit are connected to land commodification, land valorization, land assetization, and speculation in a way or another.
And thank you for the two questions. When I talk about Nairobi as an accidental colonial geography, I should really say it's an accidental colonial city, because the Imperial British East African Company had no idea what was there. They didn't care. They were just measuring halfway between Uganda and Nairobi. The mosquitoes wouldn't kill us and give us malaria. There was a lot of moral panic about malaria. And also it has water. And so they didn't care that it was an urban, it was a trading post between different ethnic groups. They didn't care. And so that's why, I mean, it was really an accidental city, because it was just by virtue of its position in the middle. There wasn't really certainly it was a logic that informed that, but it really wasn't like most cities come about because it's by the coast, or because of maybe it was an urban area already, like Zanzibar. So that's what I mean, that it was an accidental colonial geography. And in many ways, the lack of the railway to get its own revenue was not a crack, because then it facilitated and made imperative a really vitriolic settler colonialism. So if the British people needed to get back their money, all the money, and so they said, okay, let's have European settlement here and expel Africans from their land, and white people will live where it looks like Scotland, and it has better drainage and more fertile. Africans are just going to be the labor for this. And so in terms of the lack of revenue, that wasn't a crack, but there were cracks because there were all of these, for example, a seer called Mugo Gasheru, a Kikuyu sage, who said before the railway came that an iron snake would come to the land blowing smoke, and you need to be fearful of it. So people were, in some ways, his statement was visionary and prescient, and so people in some ways were maybe conditioned to look askew at the railway. There was also people like a Nandi leader called Koitalel Samoy, who stopped the railway cracks, were actually frontline work to stop the cracks, more than the lack revenue in some ways, in my opinion, because that then made imperative settler colonialism that you don't see in West Africa. Maybe you don't see in Tanzania. Of course, it's mirrored also in South Africa, but that's what it led to. And in terms of the governance structure, Mathare is actually a constituency now. It's one of the 8 constituent. I hope no Kenyan is here to question my math, but I think it's one of the 8 constituencies of Nairobi. And so it's governed by a county administration, and so it should receive, it has representatives, it has councillors, and so it's a sub-county, but it's a site that, despite always jeopardizing people's lives, renders a lot of formal and informal revenue for the state or people like the police because of taxes. Everyone is paying lots of taxes now. The food prices are so high. And so even if people are not paying maybe land rates in Mathare, the state is still getting informal taxes when the police come and raid it for illegal alcohol. And so brewers pay their tax every week right by our office in Mathare Social Justice Center. If you want to see the police collecting tax for illegal alcohol, welcome. There's a lot of drugs that pass through Mathare, and so there are other ways that it gets revenue, but also this revenue ultimately, like the Mathare residents were asking, it never comes here. I remember doing a research project on water, participatory research project, and we counted maybe 116 water points in Mathare for 200,000 people. So that means maybe 1,500 people get water from one tap. There's probably 200 toilets in Mathare for 206,000 people. Garbage is not collected. There are no hospitals. There's no high school. So the tax doesn't get there. And for me, I see this as this neglect, and because of the kind of the narratives that are told about this place and the people, but it may also be a bit just to displace people and not recognize their land claims, whether legally it's via, I think there's something called adverse ownership or adverse by virtue of having lived there for a long time. And land ownership is quite murky there because most parts are government owned, but there's some people who got allotment letters at some point. But ultimately, if the government decides you need to go, you go, just like it's going to happen now with a new road. So people are always, that displacement is always on the horizon, really shapes people's lives in both in intimate ways and in collective ways also. I'll stop now.
Well, thank you both. I think we've reached the end of our time, and that's a wonderful place to leave it off, with us wanting more. Hopefully we'll get the opportunity to read some more of your work going forward, but I think you've shared really 2 wonderful presentations that give us excellent examples of how to think with Du Bois, think with Black Reconstruction in relation to contemporary topics in the continent of Africa. So thank you both, and thank you to the audience for attending. We had a wonderful audience today from all over the world, across UCI and across the country and across the world. Please stay in touch. You can follow our future events at blackreconstructionasaportal.org so we can continue the conversation. But once again, thank you to both you, Stefan and Wangui, for a fantastic panel.
Asanteni, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. So